often than not, when a founder entrepreneur is selling his or her business, it's not like you're selling your house and then when the deal closes, you move out of the house and you don't have to deal with the buyer anymore. I like to say that buyers who've never been through this before don't know what they don't know about the process. And it's not like having a meeting, you give them your revenues, your profits, and they write you a check. As I said before, understand what the working relationship will be after the transaction closes. More often than not, there's an enormous benefit to using an advisor who understands the process, has done it before, and hopefully has experience in your industry.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of This Is M&A. My next guest is the managing director at MidCap Advisors, a boutique New York-based investment bank that specializes in lower middle market transactions. Over the course of his career, he's completed more than $2.8 billion in deals, including over $400 million in fertility and physician practice management transactions. Richard brings a rare combination of experience as both an operator and a deal maker, having served as CFO, CEO, and COO, and as an advisor to some high-growth and multi-location healthcare companies. His track record spans across capital raises, restructurings, and M&A, with entrepreneurs navigating once-in-a-lifetime events. And when he's not closing deals, he's a lifelong chess player and sport enthusiast. With that, everyone, please meet my guest, Richard Groberg.
Good afternoon, Stephen, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
I'm looking forward to it as well. I know we've had this teed up for quite some time, so I'm looking forward to just diving into some of the topics that we have at hand. I think the audience is really going to enjoy some of the topics we have. On that point, we're going to dive into a conversation that every founder eventually faces, what it really takes to sell your business. Too often, owners think it's all about purchase price. And Richard, you and I know that's not the case. The truth is, it's much, much deeper than that. So what we're going to do is we're going to ultimately unpack 3 points. One, why there's more to selling your business than just price, and why education is critical in this once-in-a-lifetime transaction for these CEOs, these founders, these entrepreneurs that you and I work with. We're also going to tap into the private equity reality check. What really happens when you take on a PE partner and why it's not always as bad as people assume, right? We're also going to touch on the deal landmines and exit strategies, how to prepare for what can go wrong and what makes deals go right. So with all that being said, why don't we just go ahead and jump right in and let's get covering some of these topics. Let's start with more than just price. Can you tell us a little bit about what do founders often, misunderstand when they really fixate on just price or the valuation?
Well, Stephen, more often than not, when a founder entrepreneur is selling his or her business, it's not like you're selling your house and then when the deal closes, you move out of the house and you don't have to deal with the buyer anymore. Most of the time, you're going back into that house the next day. You're going to operate that house and still have upside contingent payments, maybe even some acquisition clawbacks based on how you perform, except that you now have a partner who's probably paid you a lot of money and has a plan that you both have agreed to and has a say in what you do. So again, price is important, but it's also the terms. How much cash am I getting? Seller notes? Am I getting retained equity in my practice? Am I taking equity in the buyer? And then, of course, above a certain point where you're happy with the price, it then becomes, well, what's my life going to be like now the day after having a partner versus doing it on my own?
And often this isn't a partner. It's not like a husband or a wife that you've vetted out for years. This is a partner you've vetted out for maybe 8 to 12 months, right, at best.
And I've had a number of situations where I've sat down with a seller and said, I hope you understand that after this closes, you can't just take unilateral actions. You can't just spend money willy-nilly. You have someone who you've got to talk to about it. As we'll talk about later, there are some positives to that as well, but things will be different. And depending on who the buyer is, how you operate may change significantly versus they're just buying you to leave you alone. I'm sure you're going to ask me some questions later, but in the fertility business, I've sold practices where the buyer specifically said, I need help in these areas. And others where they've said, well, besides taking over my billing and collections and some quality control stuff, I want them to leave me alone. Those two sellers gravitate to different kind of buyers than each other.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It doesn't always come down to price. I think what you're hinting to is there's other factors that play into what makes a successful transaction actually happen. And I think what you're alluding to so far is your role that you play in this is the education component of that. So maybe you can tell us a bit about the educational piece and what should a first-time seller be learning before even hiring an advisor, let's just say.
There are multiple aspects to that answer. First is the preparation for the process. I like to say that buyers who've never been through this before don't know what they don't know about the process. And it's not like having a meeting, you give them your revenues, your profits, and they write you a check. There's a significant amount of preparation in terms of getting your documents together and all of your contracts and making sure as a private company, your numbers and your presentation best reflect your story. Oftentimes businesses have one-time expenses, non-recurring expenses, personal expenses that they run through the business. And part of a good banker's job is to purify your numbers so that what the buyer is seeing represents the real performance of the business, the way a buyer will look at it. It's also important, again, to have your house in order in terms of documentation and contracts and your plan so that when due diligence starts, that doesn't become a problem that requires you to double back and waste time and lose credibility and get into what I call the acquisition vortex, where you're spending so much time on those issues, you lose focus on your business and your personal life. And that's one part of it. The other part is the process, because you put together those presentations, you get everything ready, you negotiate with potential buyers that fit your strategic plan, not just money, but the other things that we talked about. And then when a letter of intent's signed, there's still a long, complicated process of due diligence and validating your financial numbers and negotiation of the final contracts that all have to happen before you close. And a good banker's job is to prepare the seller for that, to relieve them of many of the burdens of that process so they can focus on the business, but also educate them and learn about the different prospective buyers. Again, most of them, if you're going to still be around, are going to require you to keep equity in your business, take equity in the parent, or both. So you have to understand the financial wherewithal of the buyer. And are they overpricing their equity, or is it a good opportunity? And again, as I said before, I can't overemphasize enough how important it is to understand what the working relationship will be after the transaction closes in terms of what you're going to require to change or do, what are the reporting requirements, who do I answer to, and what are my responsibilities, how much autonomy I have. So a good banker works with the client to prepare for that, and then every step of the way through the negotiation process to the closing.
Makes sense. So you talked about process a bit, and I wanted to have you elaborate on that, if you don't mind, for the listeners, right? A lot of these folks, as you mentioned, it's going to be the first and largest transaction they've ever had in their life, potentially. And they're curious, what does that process even look like? What's the timeline look like? From, you mentioned LOI, right? Letter of intent for the listeners, just so those who may not be so familiar with that. Maybe let's take a step back. Richard, LOI. What is an LOI? What does that mean? Let's get that concrete for the listeners so they know exactly what that means when someone signs an LOI.
An LOI is a letter of intent, but let me take you back further. Before you get to that, we make sure that you're prepared for the process. Again, your books are in order and clean. We've represented the non-recurring and personal items. All your documentation is in order. You've put together a presentation that accurately reflects why someone would want to buy you. And then we typically together hand select who's going to get to see this opportunity. It may be 5 groups, it may be 25 groups, depending on what kind of business it is and whether they're strategic buyers or venture capitalists or private equity. And then once you start marketing the process, oftentimes before even a letter of intent, there's an indication of interest where the buyers will submit a letter saying, assuming everything as it seems to be and subject to due diligence and documentation, I'm probably going to give you a valuation of X, and here are the terms under which I buy it. You then select 2 or 3 where you'll conduct interviews between the buyer and seller under a non-disclosure agreement. And then you get to a letter of intent. Sometimes they skip the IUI. A letter of intent is a formal offer with as many of the important terms as you can, fully fleshed out and documented, so there's clarity, and so there are no complications and confusions later on. The buyer will pick one, and then both parties are under a moral and somewhat legal obligation to then move forward. Now, that obligation, if there's a material change in the business or you can't agree on certain things, either side can back out. But that's why you try to negotiate all the major points in the letter of intent so that both parties can look back to what I consider a very strong moral obligation. This is what we agreed to. And once that letter of intent is signed, the seller is not allowed to talk to anybody else during a 30, 60, 90-day period. The buyer then conducts much more intensive due diligence. They evaluate your numbers, they look at your contracts, they come visit, they do all the things they do. At some point, they get comfortable that the numbers are as represented. They then start working on the legal documents. So they're spending a lot of money. And eventually, that letter of intent translates into what are called definitive documents, purchase and sale agreements, non-compete agreements, employment agreements, various other agreements that still need negotiation. But again, if your banker has done a good job negotiating a letter of intent, all the major issues that the banker should know are going to come up have already been negotiated. And the seller won't know those things because they've never been through this before. Then eventually it goes to definitive agreements, and then you have a signed deal that then will close, and the seller and buyer exchange money, notes, equity, and other things, and the deal's done.
Perfect. Thank you so much for going through that. I think that's going to help the listeners to really get a good sense of what that process looks like. Over what period of time? I know I've talked to some. The ideal is always, can we get it done in 3 to 6 months? The reality on the data room side, I can tell you often it's 8 to 12. But what are you seeing out there as typical timeframes? Obviously, there's many variables.
So let's talk about what it depends on. It depends first on the quality of information that the seller already has. Are their books clean? Are they consistent and clean? Is it a business that requires, like in the healthcare business, there's a lot of things that have to be reconciled to go from a cash basis to accrual basis if the buyer is private equity banked or has lending. So that can slow a process, or it can make things move rather quickly. Once all that's done and the process starts of marketing to potential buyers, getting to an LOI could take a month to 3 months. The process from there can take 3 to 6 months. I've had transactions go quicker. I've had deals done when I was on Wall Street that got done in a weekend. I've had deals that, because of extraneous issues, dragged on for months and months and months because the seller had issues with the IRS, or there was a lien that needed to be released, or, in the physician business, associates who weren't locked up in contracts. So again, every situation is unique. I think the important thing is that a seller needs to be represented by bankers, advisors who really explain the lay of the land, become almost like their consigliere, if you want to go back to the movie The Godfather and that term, and represent them and explain the things to them and help them along the way, every step of the way, while still, again, protecting them from getting into what I call the transaction vortex, where they're consumed with the transaction and not their business and their personal lives.
Easy to do, and that's where the professionals come into play to really help alleviate some of that heavy lift that's required for getting ready for a deal.
Yeah, Stephen, if I can jump in for a second, I had a meeting a couple of weeks ago at our national conference with a physician who was like, tell me why I shouldn't just do this myself. And I said, I'm sure there are examples where people have, but again, you don't know what you don't know about the process. It's going to distract you from your business. And my associates and I have been in lots of situations where the seller knew who they were going to sell to before I got started or my team got started. And we still got them a better deal. We got them a better price. We negotiated better terms. We kept them from getting caught up in all this stuff. We kept legal fees from getting out of control. So, more often than not, there's an enormous benefit to using an advisor who understands the process, has done it before, and hopefully has experience in your industry or quickly can get knowledgeable about your industry.
And bringing in an advisor doesn't mean you're disconnected from the process. The CEO, the founder still plays a critical role. They're a quarterback in this whole thing.
The CEO and the board have to make the decisions, but you now have a trusted advisor to explain what things mean and what the implications are, and to make sure the contracts reflect what was agreed to. And again, if you're in the healthcare business, dealing with your associate physicians and other staff, and making sure that when you wake up the morning after, you're not in a situation you didn't want to be in, separate and apart from the money you got.
That's actually a good segue into topic number 2 that we wanted to cover, which was the private equity kind of reality check. And the reason I say it's a good segue is a question I would have is, you've lived in that PE-backed world before. What surprised you about your life the day after, right? After the deal got done?
I can tell you good stories and bad stories. I recently was on the phone with 4 physicians who went to a practice that they thought was never going to be PE owned, and now they're going to be PE owned, and they thought it was all horrific. And I explained that there's a significant amount of discipline that they bring to a business in terms of budgeting and making smart decisions that have, again, within the context of practicing good medicine or being a good steward to your business, making those decisions with some discipline, monthly reporting, streamlining things where there are economies of scale, whether it's accounting, budgeting, negotiating vendor contracts and insurance. They do this for a living. They know how to consolidate businesses, whether they're growing by acquisition or opening new locations. They have discipline in doing that. They bring money to the business that otherwise might not be available. So it is not all bad, but I also explain that most PE firms, no matter what they tell you, typically have a 4 to 6 year window to create liquidity events for their portfolio companies. That's how the members of the private equity firm make significant dollars, and successful exits are what facilitates them raising more money to do the next thing. So, a recent example, I called my plumbing company, and instead of getting the local guy, I got a national call center because people are now consolidating plumbers and electricians. And I got someone on the phone faster. I got better response time on the positive note. On the negative note, it took 2 or 3 times to get what they were required to do. But again, there's discipline and there's a lot of economies of scale of done right when private equity gets involved. The other thing that private equity can do is that if you're selling your business and you're taking part of your purchase price in equity in a firm that private equity backs and they're consolidating, you then have diversified your investment. So instead of your entire net worth being tied into your investment, you're now part of something bigger that hopefully is creating economies of scale, and they're buying at one multiple, they're building revenues, they're cutting costs. And then when they consolidate multiple businesses and they eventually exit, they exit at a higher multiple. So you actually get a second exit event, which oftentimes is very positive.
Yep. What do they call that? A second bite of the apple?
Second bite of the apple, second slice of the pie. I did a transaction about 4 or 5 years ago with the fertility business for one of the largest players in a specialty ancillary area. And the seller got a great valuation, 15 times his proved adjusted profitability. He took some seller notes that got paid out. He retained some equity in the business. I saw him at a conference a few weeks ago, and he told me that he may make more money on the second exit than the first.
Oh, man, I'm sure he's happy about that. So I guess when negotiating with PE, how can founders, I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this, how can founders negotiate, I guess, more freedom or alignment before signing with them? Because I think that's sometimes where the concern might be around PE, right? Is how much control, how much involvement are they actually going to have over what I do on a day-to-day basis? Is there some negotiating that can happen beforehand that can kind of better align around that?
Yes, but the negotiation isn't with the PE firm. It's with the buyer that the PE firm is backing. And so the question is to the leadership team of the group that's buying you, how much autonomy do you have? How involved is the PE firm in your day-to-day, week-to-week, monthly activities? And how much control are you going to exert on me? Again, in the fertility business, there are PE-backed groups that don't have a big corporate infrastructure, largely leave the practices alone, except the places they need it. And there are others that require you to change to their software, require you to evolve to their operating model, require different levels of reporting. And again, some groups need that help. Some don't want that help. So those are discussions that we work with the seller to understand how the buyer operates and make sure that they know what they're getting in for. But again, I'll remind you again, when someone writes you a large check to buy your business, they're expecting you to grow, evolve, rationalize expenses where it makes sense. That doesn't mean PE is coming in and slashing your payroll. Although, again, it depends on the deal. If you're selling to a consolidator who has infrastructure and there are going to be economies of scale, it may mean that some of what you do may change. Some of your people will become extraneous and redundant, but you have to understand that coming in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's where just making sure getting that proper alignment is extremely important through that entire process.
It's like MidCap, besides what I do as co-managing director of the healthcare group, has a very strong presence with mid-size insurance brokerages and insurance agencies and financial service companies. And some are selling to groups that are just consolidating them into their portfolio. And some are selling to groups that want to use them as a platform for further growth. And again, you have to understand where you are in your life cycle, who's likely to buy you, and what your life's going to be like after.
Makes sense. Well, let's shift gears now and let's talk about deal landmines and exit strategies. What I'd like to, I guess, start with is what can go right for founders if they get their exit strategy right from the start. So let's start with the good before we start jumping into some of the landmines.
Well, the good is when you find a buyer who pays a fair price and sets post-sale terms that keep you happy and perhaps give you rollover equity either in your practice or the parent or both, where you have an opportunity for a second exit and things go well, that creates a great event. I've seen a lot of deals where the sellers later on are very happy because they're relieved of some of the administrative burdens of running an entrepreneurial practice and get to focus on doing what they love doing, especially in the healthcare world. I heard a story today about a deal that MidCap did where the buyer added services, helped the business grow, made life better for the selling doctors. The selling doctors are making more money again because the practice is growing and they're sharing profitability. I've also seen scenarios where the sellers take equity in the parent that was overpriced and the parent didn't perform well. And I sold a business to a fertility group that went under and my residual equity was worth zero. So again, that's where a good advisor could help you make sure that who you're selling to and what your life's going to be like and the stuff you're getting is viable. and you're not in a situation where you're going to be miserable and unhappy and, be like a bear biting your arm off to get out of the bear trap.
Well, there's good advisors and then there's even great advisors, right? And I think through my lens, a great advisor is someone who's walked in my shoes, who understands what I'm going to be faced with and understands some of the challenges, not just from because I've been involved in the deal making side, but it's actually been an operator at some point. I think that adds an added value in the process.
It does. I mean, obviously, in the fertility and other healthcare spaces, my team and I, we've been sellers, we've been buyers, we've worked for private equity backed groups. We understand the landscape, but we've also operated entrepreneurial businesses. It's also important to have lawyers who actually understand what might happen down the road and think about those things. And some of that comes from input from the advisors, but I've had some phenomenal lawyers who address things that nobody's ever thought about before based on their experience of other things that have gone right or wrong. It's a little bit like when people get married, everything's wonderful, but you unfortunately have to put provisions in to deal with, well, what happens if? I'll give you another example. In the healthcare world, because of corporate practice of medicine, in most states, the buyer cannot own the medical practice. So they create a management service organization. The management service organization buys the non-medical assets and enters into a management agreement with the practice that essentially takes the profits of the practice because that's what they paid for. Now, so legally, they can't tell the physician what to do, but they just bought the practice and paid a lot of money. So the buyers put mechanisms in so that if they have to change the medical director or change the owner of the practice because the physician is being difficult, not cooperating, not going along with the global rules. And it takes lawyers who understand that to negotiate that. And I've dealt with some sellers who sold their practices years ago and wonder, why is the buyer doing that to me? I said, well, they paid you a lot of money. And if you're not going to cooperate, then what they bought isn't worth what they paid for. So we have to have the mechanisms to exert control legally. So again, having advisors and lawyers who understand that. And again, that applies to non-healthcare business as well. I mean, I've heard stories in other non-healthcare businesses where the buyer bought the business and the seller didn't like what the buyer was doing. It was like, well, when they wrote you the check, they got the right to do that unless you negotiated in your contract certain things that they're not allowed to do. Like, Stephen, I once had a deal in the veterinary industry where the seller insisted that his wife could continue to bring cookies to the practice every Friday as she had for the last 15 to 20 years. And it went in the contract.
Wow, that's interesting.
So that's like an extreme example, but it's a real example.
If a founder's listening today and they want to start preparing for an eventual exit, you talked about the process, you talked about the steps, you talked about the benefits, you talked about the outcome. What's one step? What's just step one that they need to take if that's the path they're thinking about going down?
Well, I'd hope step one is to reach out to me and my firm. We provide a lot of guidance and analysis to help a practice before they even propose an engagement. We actually are one of the rare firms that doesn't charge engagement fee or retainer or monthly progress fees. We work exclusively for your success. It's one of the reasons why I joined MidCap. The level of work that we do and consultation we do with prospective practices builds trust and credibility because, again, if you're an entrepreneur and you're selling your business, you're only probably doing this once. Maybe a few have done it before, but you're doing it once. It's personal to you. So we want to build a relation. It's important that the seller has someone they trust and has their interest at heart. And it's just not about clocking a fee. And I don't care what happens to you after it's done. So if it's not calling MidCap Advisors or me, I hope that someone thinking about selling is using what they've heard today to ask the tough questions to make sure that whoever is advising them really addresses these issues and they trust all the way through the process. I have people who I've represented in years later are calling me for input or advice or referring to me, because you are building a relationship, and we sort of consider this our business ministry to represent the entrepreneurs.
Yeah. I mean, you wouldn't buy a house or sell a house without a realtor. Don't buy or sell a business without an M&A advisor, an investment banker involved, and a right team. That's hands down probably one of the most valuable tips we can give to the audience. Make sure you're represented and you're represented appropriately.
I was just going to tell you, I told you the story earlier about someone who asked about doing it themselves. They reached back out to us yesterday and said, you were the first group that actually gave me honest answers. And I think I've got a buyer who's come to me unsolicited and said, I have to be in your market. I have to buy you. I said, look, we'll take a discount if they're the buyer, but you still want to be represented. You still need help. We're going to get you a better deal. We're going to save you from, again, the transaction vortex. And, again, you don't want to do it without help.
Yeah. Let's shift over to the opposite side of success, which is some of the landmines that could end up blowing up a deal. Walk me through, I guess, one of the biggest landmines you might have seen post LOI, right? Because I feel like most of those landmines happen at that point. And how could maybe that have been avoided? What have you seen as a trend as a landmine when you get past that stage?
Well, the couple of big ones to me are not fleshing out in the letter of intent and then the agreements what the working relationship is going to be. And if there are earnouts and potential clawbacks where things don't go well, that it's clearly defined so you don't get into this amorphous area where you can't prove that it was their fault or your fault, or you can be terminated and lose some of your rollover equity. The other area is if the buyer doesn't provide the value that they say they were going to provide and the reason why you sold to them, so you don't get the things that you hope to get, including that the equity you got ended up being worthless. I mean, I had someone approach me a couple of years ago with a client in an industry where the buyers were putting 2/3 to 75% cash and the rest in a combination of rollover equity earnouts and things like that. And they said, okay, we're going to buy you 25% down, payable over 4 years, and the rest in our equity at this huge valuation. And we're going to go public in 2 years. And I said, look, first of all, if you go public in 2 years at that valuation, my clients are not going to get to sell into the public offering. And number two, I think your valuation is way out of whack. And why would they take that risk in addition to 25% down over 4 years? Had they taken that deal, they would have lost everything.
And that's the side that doesn't get touted enough, to give exposure to the downside if you do something wrong.
And sometimes private equity firms will mark their portfolios to market every year to try to show the progress and then raise more money. And if valuations go the wrong way and you've taken rollover equity at an 18 times multiple and now the market's at 15 times, then the equity you got isn't worth what you thought you got. So, and there are cases where you got it at 15 times and now the business is sold at, 25 times.
Right. The complete opposite, 25, 30 plus.
I mean, there's some amazing success stories and then there's some, horrible exits. And it takes an advisor who understands that and can ask the right questions and push to make sure that you understand the risks versus the rewards in a transaction.
This was great. Let's get to know you a little bit. I got a kind of a personal question. Where did this interest come from? Is there a point in time when you were a kid that you can point to as an early signal that this is what you're going to be doing today, now that you're the adult doing what you're doing today?
No, Stephen. I was headed for a career in journalism. I was editor of my college paper as a sophomore, so I helped run a business. My father was a career CFO with public companies, so we sat at the dinner table and I heard stories about that. And I went to business school and got my MBA and got recruited by Texas banks when that couple lifetimes ago when the Texas banks were the rage. And my first job was as a workout lender, helping troubled companies. But I then went to work for one of the very early private equity firms when raising a couple $100 million from a bunch of wealthy families around the United States was a lot of money. So I got a taste of M&A and buying businesses in the process of negotiating and using numbers and using my journalism skill to do that. So for years and years and years, when I was CFO, COO, CEO companies, they were usually companies that were doing acquisitions, that were preparing to merge, we're going to raise financing, we're going to sell, and they were transaction oriented. So, there's a saying that salmon swim with the current. That's just where the current took me.
Do you think your dad had some influence on that? The dinner talk and him being a CFO, and do you think he had anything to play into where you ended up landing?
He was a traditional CFO and not doing a lot of M&A. But it was, for example, in journalism, you have to learn a subject and learn what makes it tick and then represent it. When you're representing companies that are selling or raising money or going public, you have to understand them. You have to represent their story in numbers and in words, and then sell to other people. And then, of course, the process of representing an entrepreneur who's built their business for their whole career and doing this one-time event is extremely rewarding. So it's not what I intended. It evolved over time. And I get great satisfaction. Again, I was at a national conference a few weeks ago. I ran into the medical director of a practice I sold a few years ago. It was a difficult transaction because there were 7 partners, and getting them to agree was tough. And to see her 2 years later and say, how's it going? Oh, it's great. We're happy. Our practice is growing. I'm happy working part-time for the corporate group. Love it. Is just very rewarding to me versus sort of the day-to-day world.
I could definitely see how that'd be the rewarding aspect of the business for sure. How do people get in touch with you? Why should they get in touch with you? Maybe if you want to just drop your contact information.
Well, my email is richard.groberg, Groberg, at midcapadvisors.com. You also can look at our website. I hope the last, 45 minutes tells you why me or why my group. We've been in your shoes. I've been a CFO of very small companies where I had to do the QuickBooks myself. I've been CFO of public companies. I've been CFO of companies in bankruptcy. I've had to be COO, CEO. So I have a unique perspective, but our group has done so many transactions that we bring expertise to bear. When I left my last job, rather than going alone, I joined MidCap because 25 years we've been doing this. And whether we need help with research or making a presentation look pretty or doing data mining, we have access to resources. I'm working on deals right now as low as 5 million and as high as 80 to 90 million. So, we've got the resources to bring to bear, and I've got a team of people that I work with and for who have great expertise and can plug into almost any industry and understand it and help with this one, again, once in a lifetime transaction.
Well, Richard, you've done a great job representing MidCap, and I'm sure our listeners enjoyed our conversation. I want to personally thank you for being on the show. I look forward to continuing our relationship, maybe inviting you to an additional podcast, maybe even some of our thought leadership stuff that we do, like fireside chats, panel discussions, etc. But for now, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Now, Stephen, this was fun. I enjoyed talking with you. Obviously, this is a subject I'm passionate about, so I appreciate the opportunity to work with your group on this and look forward to the podcast.
Definitely. That's a wrap on another episode of This Is M&A. We'll see you on the next episode. Until then, stay sharp and stay deal ready.
If this episode sharpened your thinking, share it, post your take, follow the show, or drop a quick review and bring it into your next deal. We'll be back with more real talk from people who've been in the room when it counted. The views and opinions expressed on This Is M&A are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect the views of any company or organization mentioned. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, financial, or investment advice. Always consult a qualified professional before making business decisions.